StoryCorps is a very simple idea. As Joy mentioned, we opened up our first booth in Grand Central Terminal about 4 years ago. And we built this booth where you make an appointment to bring a loved one, a parent, a friend, a grandkid, or even someone who, the person who drives your bus every morning who you want to get to know better. You come to the booth and you're met by a facilitator who's someone who serves a 1-year tour of duty with StoryCorps. We have a couple of facilitators here who you may want to talk to, Jenna and Suna. Jenna's in the back. And the facilitator talks to you for a little while and brings you in this booth and shuts the door. And here you are in the middle of Grand Central Terminal. It's completely silent when that door shuts. And you sit across from, say, your grandmother for 40 minutes. The facilitator's in the corner, and you talk about whatever you want to talk about. Most people ask the big life questions, like what are the most important lessons you've learned in life? How do you want to be remembered? People start crying off in the minute that the CDs start burning. At the end of 40 minutes, 2 CDs have been created. One goes home with you. The other stays with us. It goes to the Library of Congress so that your great-great-great-grandchildren can someday hear your grandparents' voice. And excerpts are also played every Friday on Morning Edition here on WMFE and across the country. So StoryCorps started, as I said, 4 years ago as this kind of crazy idea, and over the last 4 years it's grown tremendously. We're about the fastest growing nonprofit in the country. And what we're trying to do with StoryCorps is many things, and one of the things we're trying to do is show that our stories, the stories of regular people, the stories of everyday people, are as interesting and as important as the nonsense we're fed about Britney Spears and O.J. Simpson and all this other sludge that comes through our television sets 24 hours a day. Most people who come to StoryCorps come in pairs, but if you want to come by yourself, there are 2 facilitators always at the booth, and if you come by yourself, one of the facilitators will come into the booth with you. So there'll be a facilitator running the equipment and a facilitator asking the questions. I was doing a reading in Atlanta a couple days ago, and someone asked me if I've ever been to the booth, and I said no. And there was just gasps out of the audience. So I thought I would stop joking around up here. Yeah, no. I was telling the story last night to a group of folks from WMFE. I actually did the first, I've done a bunch of interviews in the booth, but I did the first ever interview in the booth. And part of the impetus for starting StoryCorps, I was a documentary producer for many years, about 15 years ago, I did a documentary with 2 kids growing up on the south side of Chicago. They were 12 and 13 years old, and I gave them tape recorders and asked them to create a document of a week in their lives. And it was the first sort of citizen-generated radio documentary. And I saw when these kids took tape recorders and, for instance, interviewed their grandparents, that having that microphone gave them the license to ask questions that they'd never asked before. And over the years, as these relatives passed away, these tapes became incredibly important to them. So that was a big reason, that a big kind of inspiration that led to StoryCorps. But another thing that led to StoryCorps was when I was a kid, when I was 12 years old, there was a tape recorder around my house, and I interviewed my grandparents came over for Thanksgiving. And I had this larger-than-life grandmother, and she had these larger-than-life sisters, and I interviewed them. And I'm sure I did a terrible interview. I was a complete idiot kid, but I had their voice on tape. And when I was 14, 15, 16, 17, that whole generation died. And when I was 18, I went looking for that tape, and I couldn't find it. And still, 25 years later, when I go home, I look for that tape. And I wanted to make sure that no one ever had that experience again. So that's part of why this goes to the Library of Congress. And the first interview that I did was with the last person of that generation. It was the husband of one of those aunts. His name is Uncle Sandy. And we built, this was before StoryCorps actually opened, we built a fake booth in a recording studio out of foam rubber. And I brought Uncle Sandy in, and Sandy was, unlike my aunts, he was not a big character. He was a very reserved, lovely, sweet guy. But this was kind of a test. What happens when you bring someone who's not a big storyteller into the booth? And it was magnificent. He told all of the stories he told I'd never heard before, and he talked about meeting my Aunt Bertie for the first time, and for their first date. And this was on 14th Street in Manhattan. And he talked about how he told her to meet him on this stoop on 14th Street. He picked out a stoop somewhere on the east side. And he was waiting for her, and he saw her come down the street, and she had on all purple. And he said this was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen in his life. She was just resplendent in this outfit. And he panicked, and he said, what is this glamorous, gorgeous girl going to see in me, some two-bit farm boy from Connecticut? And he went and he turned and he tried to open the door of this apartment building and escape. And the door was locked. And he broke down crying, and he said, I often think that if that door had been open, it would have destroyed my life. And they stayed married for 55 years. So that was a sign that StoryCorps is going to work. And as I was telling the folks last night, my Uncle Sandy at the time still drove around Manhattan. He was 89 when I interviewed him. He's 94 now. And he used to take that CD and listen to it over and over again in his car, which was another good indication that StoryCorps is going to work. And you know what StoryCorps, at its core, I think one of the reasons the project's been so successful is that, you know, at its core it tells people that they matter and they won't be forgotten. And that's all any of us really want to know. I mean, I think part of what StoryCorps is reminds us is of who we really are as Americans. You know, when you watch TV or you listen to some radio stations, not WMFE, you'd think that we were a nation of you know, the spoiled children of billionaires and internet sex predators, and that's not who we are. You know, we're a nation of people who live lives of kindness and sometimes heroism and compassion and love for their families. And again, those are the stories that we should be celebrating and holding up as examples to our children. But one of the great things about StoryCorps is I think that it's going to give a very rich and important sense of what life was like in the 20th and 21st century. You know, StoryCorps for us, all of our focus is on giving people an extraordinary experience in the booth. Those 40 minutes of connecting to a loved one and telling them that you love them by listening to them and kind of melting into their eyes and honoring their stories. But this historical archive, I think, is going to be incredibly important. On our website, on StoryCorps.net, you can hear hundreds of stories. You can also go to the Library of Congress. And we have permission, when you come to StoryCorps, at the end of the interview, you're asked to sign a release, if you like. If you don't want to sign a release, you walk away with both CDs. We are here as a human service. This is whatever you want. And when StoryCorps started, I knew that what was happening in the booth from the very, very early days was incredibly intimate. And I expected that we'd have somewhere between 60 and 70% compliance with signing the release. And what we've seen over the last 15,000 interviews is over 99% compliance. So everybody wants this to go to the Library of Congress. But I'm uncomfortable putting these up on the web, even though we have permission to do it, because what happens in the interviews is so intimate, and I think there are issues of privacy and identity theft that would come up. So we're still grappling about making all of the interviews accessible widely to everybody on the internet. But for now, you can go to the Library of Congress, show a piece of ID, and listen to any of the full interviews. It takes us about 2 months to process the interviews from our office into the library. I have huge expectations for this project. I was a documentary producer for many years, as Joyce said, and I've given that up. I'm going to devote the rest of my life to growing StoryCorps into a national institution. We want this to be accessible to everybody who wants to participate. We want the content to be ubiquitous, because I think this content, as you've heard, reminds us how much we share in common, who we really are as a nation. The idea that if we spent more time listening to each other and less time shouting at each other, and we're coming into a political season where the shouting has already, started and it's just going to escalate, that if we spent more time listening and less time shouting, we'd be a better, more thoughtful and compassionate nation. So yes, we have huge expectations. I want this to grow into a national institution. I hope that this lives on forever and really makes a huge difference in this country and turns us into a country of listeners and reminds us who we really are and reminds us to celebrate our families and our loved ones and the people who we meet walking down the street and get us to listen to each other. So I'm a little bit of a nut, but I do have these huge, huge expectations. And it's been, we were talking about this a little bit last night. It's a crazy project. The whole idea is completely insane. We don't charge for interviews. We ask for a $10 donation. Each interview costs us about $250 to record. So we're losing $240 at every venue, at every hour across the country. But everybody who works at StoryCorps is completely committed to this with every cell in our body. And we have made this work, and we are going to make this work. And this will grow into what it can and should become. And you guys are really the nucleus of this. I mean, we're really just getting started. And I'd ask you guys, if you buy books, fantastic. 100% of the royalties go back into StoryCorps so we can deliver more service to more people in more places. But even more important than that, spread the word, tell people about what we're trying to do, send them to our website, participate, listen, talk to loved ones. That's what I can ask you to do, because we are at the beginning of a revolution here, and you guys are just starting it out.